Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. When we think about what's going on in the Middle East today, pretty much on any given day of any given year, something is going on in the Middle East, and often Israel is at the center of it. Israel came about in modern times on May 14th, 1948, but Israel can trace its history back to one of the oldest establishments of any nation of the world. And today we're looking at when God began to form the nation of Israel. So welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. I'm Russ Brewer, and today we're going to be looking at God's call for Moses, which was the beginning of God's deliverance for his people. Now, when you think about what we've been discussing so far in this study of the Key Chapters, going all the way back to Genesis 3:15, once sin came into the world, the Lord promised Adam and Eve that one of their descendants would destroy Satan. Then in Genesis 8:21, the Lord promised to Noah that he would no longer destroy every single person. The Lord promised to Abraham in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 and Genesis 22 that in him all the nations would be blessed, that there would be a seed, a person who would bring about this blessing. Even in Genesis 49, Jacob as a prophet told his son Judah that through him would be a descendant who would be a ruler of the peoples of the world. And so throughout the book of Genesis, we're seeing that God is making these incredible promises to his people. It's extraordinary that God would make any promises to anyone, let alone fulfill them like we're seeing him do. But we're also seeing something of an implied tension here, because the problem is, they sound great, but how do we keep track of them? Well, the answer is that God will establish a nation of his people who will be able to trace their lineage all the way back to Adam and Eve, who will be a sovereign nation, who will be separate from the world, who will keep God's commands and follow God's ways, who won't mix into the world's ways, but they will be stewards of God's promises and his truths so that they can identify when the Messiah has come, and then when he comes, announce his arrival to the rest of the world. And so today we're looking at Exodus chapter 3. We're going to see God's call upon Moses as he begins to deliver his people so that they can return to the promised land and establish this nation. So now as we turn to Exodus chapter 3, just to set the scene, we need to remember Exodus chapter 2, that Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. Then in Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, Moses killed an Egyptian. He incurs the wrath of Pharaoh, who might have been like a grandfather to him, and Moses has to flee then to a region called Midian. But then in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, Pharaoh has died, and we know from Acts chapter 7, verse 30, that 40 years have passed since Moses' flight first from Egypt in Exodus chapter 2. And so now Moses is 80 years old in chapter 3, verse 1. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Now, you'll remember that Moses had come to Midian and he had rescued the daughters of a priest there, and the priest's name was Jethro, and he gave one of his daughters, Zipporah, to be Moses' bride. And so now in verse 1, Moses is shepherding Jethro's flock. And think about that for a moment, because remember, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household. He's been trained in the ways of Pharaoh. He has had all of those privileges, all of that luxury, and now he's in this distant region shepherding sheep. This is an amazing fall from Moses' former place of privilege. Genesis 46:34 tells us that the Egyptians loathed shepherds, and Moses grew up in that world, and now he's having to do the very thing his culture despised. This helps us to see that there are times when the Lord will bring us low, very low, before he lifts us up. The problem is, sometimes we're hoping God will bring us low and then exalt us, but often it doesn't work out that way. We tend to think that we deserve a place of exaltation, and sometimes the Lord will just bring us to a lowly position for an extended period of time so that we finally come to the point of realizing it's not about us. It's not about what we want to do. It's about us being completely submitted to the Lord. And so Moses is in this region of Midian for 40 years. Just think about that. 40 years is a long time. God placed Moses in this desert region, taking care of these lowly sheep for 40 years to fully burn off and fully crucify Moses' pride that we see in Exodus chapter 2, to bring him to a place of humility and submission that we now see him here in Exodus chapter 3. So continuing on in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is here shepherding this flock, and he comes to Horeb in verse 1. Now Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. And verse 2 says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to him in blazing fire in the midst of a bush." Now who is this? Well, if you look down at verse 6, the angel of the Lord tells us, he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Now, personally, I'm always fascinated by the fact that the Lord appears to Moses as a fire. This is actually pretty common in the Bible. The Lord appears as fire in Genesis 15 when he made his covenant with Abraham and appeared as a smoking oven and a flaming torch. He also appeared as fire in Exodus 13. The Lord will lead his people as a pillar of fire. In Exodus 9, the Lord appeared as fire over the tabernacle. In Daniel 7, the Lord sits upon a throne of fire. In Deuteronomy 5, the Lord speaks with his people as through fire. So it's pretty common. And Hebrews 12:29 says that God is a consuming fire. Fire shows his holiness. It shows his righteousness. It shows his glory and his awesomeness. And he's not one to be trifled with. And think about this. What's the most common substance in the entire universe? It's burning fire. It's burning plasma. When you go out at night and you look up those stars, what you're actually seeing is giant, massive balls of fire. I don't think it's any coincidence that the most abundant material in this universe also reflects God's nature of his holiness and his glory. Every star is a monument to the holiness of God. Well, going on in our passage here, you have this angel speaking to Moses, identifying himself as the God of Moses' father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he wants Moses to know that he is the God of Moses' people, going back to his own father, which had been Amram from Exodus chapter 6, or even to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the Lord appears to Moses in this burning bush. Thing is, sometimes we want our own burning bush. We want this personal visit from God. We want things so clear, and people can be disappointed that God hasn't appeared to them in their own burning bush. But we need to remember, one, that this is a one-time event, and two, Moses has spent 40 years now in this region. We don't normally say, I'd like the burning bush, but I'm okay waiting 40 years for it. Because you've got to remember, it took 40 years for the Lord's work in Moses' life to bring him to the point where he's willing to actually hear from God and obey God's call upon his life. And so after 40 years, God's work in Moses' life has brought him to this place, and now he's ready to hear from God and obey him. So going on in chapter 3, verse 6, we see how Moses responds to the Lord. It says, "Then Moses hid his face, for he's afraid to look at God." And so we see God's holiness in verse 5, we see Moses' response to God's holiness in verse 6, and we see God's faithfulness in verse 7. In verse 7, the Lord says, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings." Now, this phrase, "for I am aware of their sufferings," could also be, "I have carefully watched." God is aware of their sufferings, and we're seeing here his faithfulness and his compassion to his people. And in verse 8, he has come now to deliver them and bring them to the land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of God's promises to Abraham back in Genesis 15. And so those prophecies are now being fulfilled. Now that time is complete. Now is the time for God's people to rise on up and be delivered. And he's going to bring them back to this land, which, by the way, the Lord tells Moses in verse 8, this land is filled with Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They're all dwelling there. So you can imagine how daunting this must have sounded to Moses. Moses' people are slaves. He's banished. And God is saying, I'm going to deliver my people and bring them back to this promised land. And, by the way, in verse 10, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. So now we're seeing that God's got this grand plan for his people, and it involves Moses. And look at Moses' response in verse 11. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" Now, this is really mock humility. At this point, the Pharaoh that sought his death is now dead. And so this new Pharaoh is probably someone that Moses knew well because they grew up in the same house. So who is Moses to do this work? Well, he's a great option. He's one of the few Jewish people who could actually knock on Pharaoh's door and have him open that door for a real conversation. Not only that, Moses' response doesn't reflect a proper understanding of God's power. Moses still needed to grow in his understanding that when God gives a person a task, he gives us everything we need to accomplish that task. And yet we should also point out that the Lord doesn't butter him up. The Lord doesn't tell Moses, "Hey, Mo, you're a great guy. You've got this. You'll do great. I believe in you." He doesn't say that because the issue is not about who is Moses, but who is God. And so the Lord answers Moses in verse 12 saying, "Certainly I will be with you." And so the Lord's going with Moses. That's all he needs. And this is an implied promise that God has made every provision for Moses in this task. When the Lord promises to be with him, he will be all that Moses needs for this whole adventure. Nothing's going to be taking God by surprise. Everything is going to be coming about. It has already been prepared for by the Lord. Moses simply needs to be faithful to the Lord and walk in these promises. So going on to verse 13, Moses then says, okay, so let me get this straight. I'm going to be going to the sons of Israel. I'm going to be saying to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. What if they say to me, well, what's his name? What should I say to them? And the Lord answers Moses in verse 14 saying, I am who I am. Now this is an incredible statement as well because the Lord is describing himself as the God who always is. That's his name. The Hebrew word for the Lord's name is Yahweh. It means I am. Now sometimes people call the Lord Jehovah, but that's actually not only a mispronunciation, it's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew text. In the Hebrew Bible, the Lord's name is so holy that the ancient Israelites would not say his name. And rather than say his name, they would say Adonai, which was also the Hebrew word for Lord. And so to remind them not to say his name Yahweh, when they would write his name, they would write the letters for Yahweh, but then add the vowels for the name Adonai. And when they saw this hybrid word, they would just know to call him Adonai. But somewhere over the last few centuries or so, people started looking at this Hebrew word Yahweh with the vowels for Adonai and just kind of say them all together. And so it kind of began to come on out as Jehovah. And people have been doing this for a while, but oddly enough, Jehovah is not the Lord's actual name, and it's not pronounced that way in any language. It's Yahweh or Adonai or Lord, or like our Bibles. They just have them all capitalized Lord to show us that's the Hebrew word Yahweh. Now anyway, going back to our text here, we need to realize that this is not the first time that the Jews have ever heard the Lord called this. If you go back to the book of Exodus and you read through it, you'll see the name Lord capitalized all over the place. That's because it's always the Hebrew word Yahweh. And then now here in Exodus chapter 3, when the Lord tells Moses to say, "Tell them that I am has sent you," that was the name for God that was familiar to all his people. And when the Lord says this to Moses, he is announcing, he wants Moses to go in and announce that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is now moving and now working in their deliverance. And so God wants Moses to go back to the land, to go back to the people he's been banished from, to go back to the people who haven't seen him in 40 years, to go back to the people who the last time they saw him were kind of ridiculing him. God wants Moses to go back to these people and gather the elders together and tell them that God is going to call them out of Egypt. And the Lord gives Moses encouragement in verse 18 saying, they will pay heed to what you say. And ultimately that's because God is the one who is working behind the scenes. And so this is an incredible calling upon Moses that the Lord has placed. And there's just one small minor point still to go. Yeah, the elders are going to listen to you, Moses. But Pharaoh, verse 19, not so much. And so in verses 19 and 22, the Lord basically says, so he's not going to listen to you. So I'm going to be doing a tremendous amount of miracles through you to make all this work. But don't worry, I've got this. You just obey me. And so you can see God has this incredible plan for Moses' life. And it begins right here in Exodus 3. And it requires Moses to understand who God is, to believe him, to obey him, to walk in his promises, and to go forward in the strength and grace of the Lord and begin the deliverance of God's people. And so then all of this brings us back to where it first began. This isn't simply just the account of God calling a man into service. This is the account of God fulfilling his promises that go all the way back to Adam and Eve or to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're seeing here all of the work and all of the preparation that God has put into solving the problem of our sin, and not just for the Jews, but ultimately for all of humanity. And this shows us God's trustworthiness and his faithfulness and his love for his people. And finally, this also shows us that the more we understand God, the more we understand he has called us out of this world to be his people. That's what God is doing here. He's calling these Jews out of Egypt. He calls us out of this world to gather together before him in worship and obedience. And so God's got this plan for Moses. He has a plan for his people. He has a plan for your life as well. And our greatest joy and our greatest peace will be when we live and walk according to his plan for our lives. Moses had to spend 40 years in this wilderness to get his theology right about God and develop a right view of himself and actually obey the Lord. Now, the Lord may have brought you into some barren region as well to work on you so that you would come to the place of understanding about who God is, that you can trust him, believe his promises, and walk in the calling he has for you and obey him in every detail of your life. Well, we'll end things there. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, and God bless.